In a quiet small town where life moves slowly, Emily, a young waitress, does the unexpected. One morning, she serves a hot meal to a ragged homeless man outside the diner. Her simple, selfless act prompts the narrator, a retired old man, to scoff, thinking her naive. But the next morning, 200 soldiers line up outside the diner, led by a lieutenant general. The mysterious man's identity begins to unravel, hinting at a profound story. What secret lies behind this stranger? And how could one kind gesture ripple through a town that never changes? Thank you for joining this story. If it moved you, please leave a like, subscribe, and share to spread the message of kindness. Share your own story in the comments. Stay tuned for more heartfelt tales of honor and hope. Let's all be a little more like Emily. I'm just an old man tucked into the corner booth of the diner, cradling my black coffee as I do every morning, letting the bitter warmth anchor me to the rhythm of another predictable day. The diner, with its red shingle roof glowing like burnished copper in the early sun, sits at the heart of our small town, a place where time seems to have settled in for a long nap. Main Street hums with a quiet familiarity. Shopkeepers sweep their stoops, neighbors wave whether they know you or not, and the faded billboards along the road tell stories of a world that's moved on everywhere but here. The bank's brass door handles still gleam with stubborn pride. The movie theater still plays John Wayne on Fridays, and this diner with its buzzing neon sign feels like the pulse of it all. For me, it's more than a place to eat. It's a sanctuary of routine, a living scrapbook of a life spent delivering mail through rain and snow for 30 years until my knees and back decided I'd carried enough. Retirement didn't fit me at first. I was used to bringing something to people, letters, packages, pieces of their lives. Now I just bring myself here. Same booth, same mug, same black coffee, no cream, no sugar. By 7:30 sharp, the folded newspaper waits for me like an old friend, and the regulars nod as if we're all part of some unspoken pact to keep this town exactly as it's always been. This town doesn't do surprises. It's a place where change is as welcome as a tax audit. The barber's sign might get a fresh coat of paint, or Eddie's gas station might nudge the price up a nickel, but that's about as wild as it gets. So when the bell above the diner door jingled that morning, I barely looked up. Just another sound in the symphony of clinking plates and murmured conversations. But then he walked in, a man who seemed to carry the weight of the world in his silence. His clothes were a patchwork of rags, a dark green coat so worn it looked like it might dissolve in the next rain. The cuffs were frayed, buttons long gone, one sleeve held together with clumsy red stitches, as if someone had tried to mend it with more hope than skill. His white beard was a tangled mess, and his eyes stayed fixed on the floor, like he was afraid to claim too much space. He didn't beg, didn't speak, just shuffled to a spot near the door and sat, still as a shadow. Most of us glanced and turned away, myself included, I'm not proud to admit. I sipped my put my coffee, thinking he'd be gone soon, another fleeting figure in a town that doesn't hold on to strangers. But Emily noticed him. Emily, the young waitress, maybe 26 or 27, with a smile that could make you believe kindness hadn't gone out of style. She'd been at the diner less than a year, but she'd already woven herself into the fabric of this place. Her smile wasn't the flashy kind some servers put on for tips. It was genuine, the kind that made you feel seen, even if you were just an old man ordering the same coffee every day. She had a way of remembering the little things, your birthday, how you liked your eggs, when your cup needed a refill before you even asked. But for all her warmth, Emily was a closed book. No chatter about her life, no gossip, no complaints. She just tied her apron, poured coffee, and took care of people like it was her calling. That morning, she saw him when no one else did. Not just saw him the way you notice someone who's trying so hard to be invisible. Without a word, she moved with that quiet purpose of hers, plated up a steaming breakfast, eggs, bacon, toast, the works, and set it in front of him, free of charge. I watched, my mug halfway to my lips, and felt a flicker of something I couldn't name. Cynicism, maybe. I chuckled under my breath, thinking, what a waste. He'll probably just take it and disappear. I'd seen enough of the world to know kindness often goes unrewarded, especially in a place like this, where people cling to what's theirs. But the next morning, everything changed. I was in my usual booth, coffee in hand, the world outside humming along in its predictable way, when I glanced out the window and nearly dropped my mug. There, lined up in perfect formation, stood 200 soldiers, their boots gleaming, their faces stern and solemn. They stretched across the street, a sea of uniforms under the morning sun, right outside the diner. My heart stuttered. In a town where the biggest event is the annual fair, this was unthinkable. I felt the weight of it, the way you feel a storm coming before the first thunderclap. My hands shook as I set my coffee down, my mind racing to make sense of it. Who were they? Why were they here? The other regulars froze, forks hovering over plates, conversations cut off mid-sentence. The air in the diner thickened with a mix of awe and unease, like we were all holding our breath, waiting for the world to explain itself. Emily stood behind the counter, her apron slightly crooked, her face pale but composed. She didn't flinch, didn't gape like the rest of us. But I saw it in her eyes, a flicker of something deep, something private, like she knew more than she'd ever let on. The soldiers weren't just passing through. They were here for her. I didn't know how or why, but I felt it in my bones, the way you feel a truth before you understand it. That one small act, her giving that man a meal, had set something in motion, something bigger than this diner, bigger than this town. I sat there, an old man in a corner booth, my coffee growing cold, and realized I'd been wrong. Not just about her, but about this place, about what kindness could do. It wasn't a waste. It was a spark, and it had lit a fire I'd never expected to see. The diner hummed with the familiar chaos of a morning rush, plates clattering, voices overlapping, and the steady sizzle of bacon on the grill. Most patrons were too absorbed in their routines, sipping coffee or skimming newspapers, to notice anything beyond their own tables. But Emily, she was different. There was a quiet determination in her movements, a kind of grace that didn't shout for attention, but held it all the same. Without a word, she reached for a clean plate from behind the counter, her hands steady, her face softened by a resolve that seemed to come from somewhere deep within. She built a small tower of food with care, pancakes stacked high, warm and golden, scrambled eggs puffed up like clouds, hash browns crisp at the edges, their edges catching the light, and 4 thick slices of bacon, smoky and just crisp enough, the way I'd always liked mine. She set the plate on a tray, poured a glass of orange juice that glowed like the sunrise, and stepped outside with the ease of someone refilling a condiment bottle. Through the diner's window, I watched her, my coffee growing cold in my hands. She approached the man on the bench outside, his figure slumped against the morning's chill. He was a shadow most of us passed by without a second glance. A worn coat, a face etched with stories no one cared to hear. Emily knelt slightly, bringing her eyes level with his, her gaze carrying a warmth that felt almost holy. She spoke softly, words I couldn't hear, but they seemed to carry a weight that hung in the air. For a brief moment, something passed between them. Not pity, not a handout, but a quiet acknowledgement, a mutual recognition of humanity. Maybe it was respect. She placed the tray beside him on the bench, offered a small, genuine smile, and returned to the diner as if she'd done nothing extraordinary. I leaned toward the busboy, a lanky teenager wiping down the counter, and whispered, "Did the manager sign off on that?" He gave a half-hearted shrug, his focus still on his rag. Later, when I shared the story with a friend, I found myself saying, she didn't even check with the manager. Just acted, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That was what made it so powerful. Emily didn't hesitate, didn't calculate the point or seek permission. She didn't question whether the man deserved him. She saw someone hungry, and that was enough. Reflecting now, that single act of compassion spoke louder than any grand gesture I'd witnessed in years. I'll admit something I kept to myself at the time. When I saw Emily hand over that plate, I didn't feel inspired or proud. I didn't nod in quiet approval. Instead, I let out a soft, cynical chuckle into my coffee, masking a flicker of discomfort. She's young, I thought. Green, trying to be a hero for a day. I figured it was a fleeting moment of idealism, one that would pass, leaving the diner short a few dollars and a clean plate. Maybe she'd get a talking to from the manager. Maybe the man would loiter, unsettling the regulars who preferred their mornings predictable. Maybe he'd return daily, expecting more. In that moment, I saw him not as a person, but as an inconvenience, a ripple in the smooth flow of my morning. I don't like owning up to that, but it's the truth. There was something else too, a quiet unease that stirred in me. The man's presence felt like a blemish on the diner's warmth. His tattered coat and silent demeanor, a smudge on the clean glass of the window. It wasn't fear, just a vague discomfort, as if his existence dulled the comfort of the place. It's odd how quickly we judge, even when we think we're better than that. But then, something caught my eye, a detail that shifted everything. His coat, old, frayed, but unmistakably military green. Army issue. Near the shoulder, I noticed the faint outline of stitching, the ghost of a patch, long removed. My stomach churned, shame rising like bile. My father fought in Normandy. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, the works. He didn't talk about it much, but I grew up feeling the weight of what those years cost him. I remembered a day from my childhood, watching him hand a sandwich to a man in a faded uniform by the railroad tracks. When I asked why, he said, "We never leave our own behind." Those words slammed into me now, because here I was, judging a man for being worn and alone, wrapped in what might have been the last thread of his identity. And Emily, so much younger, had seen what I'd lost sight of. She didn't see a problem. She saw a person. Staring into my coffee, I caught my reflection, and the man looking back felt small, unworthy of the pride I'd once carried. The man didn't stay long, 15, maybe 20 minutes. He sat on the bench, hunched over the plate Emily had given him, eating with a slow, deliberate care, as if each bite was a gift he needed to honor. There was no rush, no mess, no plea for more. Every forkful seemed to carry weight, as if he were savoring not just the food but the moment itself. From my seat, I watched him through the diner's wide window, the morning sun casting him in a soft, almost painterly light. Steam rose from the eggs and hash browns, curling around his face, softening the deep lines etched by time and hardship. He looked tired, not just from a sleepless night, but with the kind of weariness that comes from carrying the world's weight for too long. The man sat alone at the diner's counter, his shoulders hunched as if bearing an invisible burden that weighed heavier than anything tangible. His eyes, shadowed with exhaustion, held a story no one could read, a fatigue that ran deeper than the lines etched into his weathered face. The diner, usually alive with the hum of small-town chatter, had fallen silent. Forks hovered midair, coffee cups rested untouched, their steam curling upward in lazy spirals. Newspapers drooped in idle hands. The air felt thick, not with judgment, but with a collective pause, as if everyone sensed something profound was unfolding. We weren't staring to gossip or critique. We were simply watching, holding our breath for something we couldn't yet name. He moved with a deliberate slowness that commanded attention. When he finished his meal, he set his fork down with care, as if the act carried a weight of its own. He reached for the napkin, wiping the corner of his mouth with a precision that felt almost ceremonial. Then, with the same measured grace, he folded the napkin into a neat square, aligning its edges as though it were a sacred ritual. His knees creaked loudly as he stood, the sound cutting through the diner's stillness, audible even through the thick glass window that separated us from the world outside. He paused, his gaze lingering on the empty plate before him, as if it held some unspoken answer. Then he lifted his eyes not to the crowd of onlookers, but to the door of the diner, where the morning light spilled in. With a motion that felt both ancient and reverent, he raised his right hand and placed it over his chest. It wasn't a salute, nothing so formal, but a gesture steeped in respect. A quiet acknowledgement of something greater than himself. His head dipped in the slightest nod, directed not at the crowd, not at the curious faces pressed against their own reflections in the glass, but at her. Emily. She had just stepped back outside to check the sidewalk, her apron slightly askew, her hands dusted with flour from the morning's work. When she saw him, her face softened into a smile. Not the forced grin of someone playing a role, but the warm, genuine curve of recognition, like two souls meeting in a fleeting moment of mutual understanding. She didn't make a fuss or draw attention. Instead, she met his gaze with steady eyes and said softly but clearly, "Have a good morning, sir." He nodded once more, a silent reply that carried the weight of gratitude, then turned and walked down the street. His steps were slow, measured, his posture upright despite the invisible load he carried. No one clapped, no one whispered. The diner remained wrapped in a silence that wasn't cold or uncomfortable but heavy with meaning. It pressed against the walls, settled over the booths and policy ball. W, X.com, Grok, status, 1859611234513591616, ref, sarsu, tbsrc, edf. It lingered in the air, thick as the scent of bacon and syrup, a silence born not of indifference but of reverence. It was the kind of quiet that descends when people realize they've just witnessed something sacred, something too profound for words to capture. In that moment, we were all humbled by a stranger's quiet dignity, by a young woman's simple kindness, by a gesture that spoke louder than any speech could. None of us had the words to break that silence, and perhaps that was the point. Some truths are too vast for language. The next morning began like any other, or so it seemed. I arrived at the diner earlier than usual, 6:45 a.m., my body restless from a night of fitful sleep. The man from the day before haunted my thoughts, his silence, his gesture, Emily's gentle response. It played over and over in my mind, like a memory I couldn't shake. I settled into my usual corner booth, the dim lights casting soft shadows across the checkered floor. The air smelled of freshly brewed coffee, and the jukebox hummed a faint, nostalgic tune, grounding me in the familiar rhythm of the place. Everything was as it should be until I glanced out the foggy window. Through the misted glass, I saw the first pair of boots, black leather, polished to a mirror shine, laced tightly to the shin. Then another pair, and another. Within moments, the street outside the diner transformed. Soldiers lined both sides of Main Street, standing in quiet formation, their presence as steady and deliberate as a heartbeat. Marines in crisp dress blues, Army Rangers in formal greens, Navy SEALs in sharp desert tan, Air Force officers with pressed coats adorned with rows of ribbons. They were all there, shoulder to shoulder, stretching down the sidewalk in both directions. At least 200 of them, maybe more, stood in silence. No shouting, no salutes, just a profound, unshakable presence. Some held their caps tucked under their arms, others clasped their hands behind their backs, their eyes fixed on the diner as if it were a hallowed place. Inside, the clatter of forks hitting plates broke the quiet. A coffee spoon slipped from someone's hand, its sharp clink echoing louder than it should have. Every head turned toward the window, drawn to the sight unfolding outside. Then he appeared. A black SUV pulled up at the end of the street, and from it stepped a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his presence radiating authority. The morning sun caught the 3 stars gleaming on his shoulder, a lieutenant general, if my memory served. He walked alone, no aides, no reporters, just him, his steps slow and purposeful. When he reached the front of the diner, he paused, removed his cap, and looked through the glass. His gaze wasn't for us, the onlookers frozen in our booths, but for the counter, where Emily stood unaware, wiping her hands on her apron, her focus on the morning's tasks. As Emily filled a fresh pot of coffee, the familiar hum of her soft tune filled the quiet air of the diner, a morning ritual that grounded her in the rhythm of another ordinary day. The scent of brewing coffee mingled with the faint aroma of bacon sizzling on the grill, and the clatter of dishes in the back created a comforting backdrop. She moved with the ease of someone who knew every inch of this place, her hands steady, her mind drifting to the small tasks ahead, refilling sugar jars, wiping down the counter. It was a simple life, one she'd built with care, and she found a quiet pride in the way she made the diner feel like home for anyone who walked through its doors. But when one of the busboys whispered her name, his voice low and urgent, her heart gave a little jolt. She turned, expecting nothing more than a spilled tray or a customer's question, her lips already curling into a reassuring smile. What she saw instead stopped her cold. A wall of uniforms stood just outside the diner's glass door. Soldiers, dozens of them, standing in perfect formation, their faces unreadable, their silence heavy with purpose. Her hands tightened around the coffee pot, the warmth of the glass grounding her as her mind raced. What was this? Her mouth parted slightly, a question forming but not yet voiced, as confusion and curiosity tangled in her chest. She set the pot down with care, as if moving too quickly might shatter the moment, and stepped out from behind the counter. Each step toward the door felt lighter than it should, as though her body wasn't entirely sure it belonged in this unfolding scene. Her apron swayed slightly, still tied around her waist, and her sneakers squeaked faintly on the linoleum floor. When she reached the door and pushed it open, a rush of cold morning air swept in, sharp and electric, carrying with it a weight she couldn't name, something that felt like reverence, like history pausing to take a breath. Emily stood in the doorway, her eyes scanning the rows of soldiers, their postures rigid with discipline, their gazes fixed forward. She didn't know it yet, but every one of them was there for her, their presence a silent tribute to a moment she hadn't even realized was monumental. Inside the diner, the usual hum of conversation had dissolved into a hush, so complete that the faint creak of the front door echoed as it swung open again. A man stepped inside, his presence commanding the room without effort. He was tall, his silver-tipped hair catching the light, his uniform adorned with medals that gleamed with the weight of a lifetime of service. This was no ordinary officer. This was a general, his every movement deliberate, his composure that of someone who had walked into rooms where decisions changed lives. Emily's breath caught as he crossed the diner with measured steps, his eyes locked on her. She stood frozen behind the counter, the coffee pot still in her hands, its weight suddenly heavier as her fingers trembled, just enough to betray her nerves. Her heart pounded, not from fear but from the overwhelming sense that something far bigger than her small world was unfolding. The general stopped in front of her, his expression unreadable but kind, and without a word he reached into the breast pocket of his coat. From it, he drew a crisp, sealed envelope, its edges pristine, as though it carried something too important to be marred by the world's imperfections. He placed it on the counter with a gentleness that felt almost sacred, his fingers lingering for a moment as if to ensure it was safe. Then, in a gesture that seemed to pull the air from the room, he raised his hand to his brow in a salute. It wasn't a flourish or a performance. It was precise, formal, steeped in the kind of honor that only comes from years of discipline and sacrifice. Emily's eyes widened, her breath shallow as she tried to process the weight of it. This salute, this moment, was for her. Her mind scrambled to make sense of it, but all she could feel was the gravity of his gesture, the way it seemed to hold her in place, as though she were being honored for the first time. The general held the salute a moment longer, his eyes steady on hers, and when he lowered his hand, his voice broke the silence, low, firm, and clear, cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Miss Emily," he began, his tone carrying the weight of authority tempered by warmth, "this letter is to formally inform you that the man you served yesterday was Sergeant Lawrence Hawk Dawes, former squad leader, 3rd Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment, presumed missing in action during a covert operation outside Kandahar, Afghanistan, 15 years ago." The words landed like stones in a still pond, rippling through the diner, through Emily's mind, through the hearts of everyone listening. Sergeant Dawes. The name stirred something in the back of her memory, a half-remembered story whispered in the town years ago. An elite soldier, a legend in his own right, who had vanished without a trace during a mission shrouded in mystery. His unit had returned, battered but alive. He hadn't. The story had faded over time, as stories do, becoming little more than a ghost in the collective memory of the town. The general's voice steadied as he continued, each word deliberate, as though he knew the weight they carried. "For over a decade, we searched for him. He was declared lost, perhaps dead. But yesterday morning, for the first time in 15 years, he made contact." He paused, letting the impossibility of those words settle over the room. Emily's heart raced, her mind flashing to the man she'd served the day before. A quiet figure, weathered and worn, with eyes that seemed to carry a story too heavy to tell. She'd given him a hot meal, called him sir out of habit, smiled as she always did. It had been nothing, she thought. Just another customer, Another small act of kindness in a day full of them. But the general's next words shattered that thought. Your kindness, your simple act of respect, was what reached him, he said, his voice softening but no less commanding. He told us it was the first time in years that someone looked at him not as a ghost, not as a problem, not as a burden, but as a soldier, a man. You reminded him who he was. Emily's chest tightened, her eyes wide with disbelief. She wanted to speak, to ask questions, to understand, but her voice felt trapped, caught somewhere between shock and an overwhelming wave of emotion she couldn't name. Her hands, still clutching the coffee pot, trembled more noticeably now, and she set it down carefully, afraid she might drop it. The general's gaze never wavered, steady and kind, as he placed one hand over the envelope and slid it gently toward her. This is his official return notice, he said. He wanted you to have it. He wouldn't come in with us this morning. He said this cafe was your place, that you gave him peace when he had none. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And Emily's eyes flicked to the envelope, its crisp edges suddenly seeming fragile, as though it held not just paper, but a piece of a man's soul. The general turned slightly, his gaze sweeping over the diner, the stunned faces of the regulars, the forks paused mid-bite, the coffee cups cooling untouched on the tables. That meal, he said, his voice carrying a quiet conviction, was more than breakfast. It was the final signal he needed to come home. He nodded once more to Emily, a gesture of respect that felt as weighty as his salute, and then stepped back. There was no fanfare, no grand proclamation, just a man who had seen wars and led armies walking out of a small-town diner, leaving behind a letter and a moment that would linger in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. Emily stood there, her hands gripping the envelope as though it might dissolve if she let go. Her mind was a storm of emotions, disbelief, pride, humility, and something deeper. Something that felt like the weight of a man's life resting in her hands. She thought of the soldier she'd served, the way his eyes had lingered on the plate of eggs and toast, the way he'd thanked her quietly, almost as if he didn't trust his own voice. She hadn't known his story, hadn't known the shadows he carried, but in that moment, she'd seen him, and somehow that had been enough. The diner remained silent as the soldiers outside dispersed, their boots crunching faintly on the gravel lot. The general was gone, the door swinging shut behind him, but the air still felt charged, as though the weight of the moment hadn't fully lifted. Emily's gaze dropped to the envelope, her fingers tracing its edges. It wasn't just a letter, it was proof that a single act of quiet dignity could reach into the darkness and pull someone back. Around her, the diner slowly came back to life, murmurs of conversation, the clink of a spoon against a mug. But Emily stood still, the envelope anchoring her to the moment. Outside the diner's windows, the world moved on. Cars passing on Main Street, the morning sun climbing higher. But inside, time felt suspended, as though the story of Sergeant Dawes and Emily's small act of kindness had carved out a space that would never quite fade. No one touched their coffee after the general left. It sat cooling on the tables, forgotten, as the weight of what had just happened settled over the room like a quiet, unspoken vow to remember. The town seemed to exhale and move on, as if nothing had changed. Cars rolled lazily down Main Street, their engines humming a familiar tune, while dogs barked from porches, chasing the echoes of a quiet morning. The rhythm of our small town crept back in, steady and unassuming, like the world hadn't just shifted beneath our feet. But for me, tucked into the corner booth of the diner, the air felt heavier, charged with a truth I couldn't shake. My gaze lingered on the countertop where moments ago a letter had sat, folded, worn, and heavy with meaning. Emily had taken it with both hands, her fingers trembling, her face drained of color. She stood frozen, her silence louder than any words she could have spoken. She didn't look around, didn't see me watching from my seat, my heart sinking under the weight of my own shame. Maybe it was better that way. I wasn't sure I could have faced her, not after what I'd done. I'd laughed when she fed him. That was the truth I'd carry, a jagged splinter lodged in my chest. I'd sat there, smug in my assumptions, sipping coffee that tasted more bitter with every passing second. I'd watched her carry a plate to a man whose eyes were hollow, whose clothes hung loose on a frame that life had worn thin. I'd smirked, wrapped in my own self-righteous ideas of who deserved kindness and who didn't. I'd worn a uniform once, stood tall under the flag, and carried my father's stories of Normandy like they made me someone who understood honor. Years of government service had convinced me I had a moral compass, a sense of right and wrong forged by time and duty. But Emily, she didn't need a uniform or a title to know what was right. She didn't need to know the man's name or the scars he carried. She saw hunger and gave him food. She saw a man adrift and offered him respect. In one simple act, she reminded a soldier of his worth when the rest of us had let him fade into the shadows of our busy lives. Her kindness cut deeper than any speech I'd heard or medal I'd seen pinned to a chest. It exposed the hollowness of my judgment, the arrogance I'd worn like a second skin. I'd sat there, chuckling at her compassion, and now the memory of that laugh burned like acid. I wanted to say sorry, to find words that could bridge the chasm between who I'd been in that moment and who I wanted to be now. But sorry felt too small, too flimsy to carry the weight of my regret. So I reached for my wallet instead, my fingers brushing against the worn leather as I pulled out a crisp $50 bill. I slid it under my coffee mug, the paper catching slightly on the chipped ceramic. I didn't leave a note, didn't call the waitress over, didn't try to explain. It wasn't about the money, it could never be enough to right my wrong. But it was a gesture, a quiet plea for forgiveness I didn't deserve. When I pushed open the diner's glass door, the morning sun washed over me, warm and unrelenting. It pulled a memory from the depths of my mind, one I hadn't visited in years. I saw my father standing at the kitchen sink, his hands rough and stained with grease from hours spent coaxing our old pickup back to life. I was just a boy, trailing behind him with endless questions. I'd asked why he'd saluted a man in ragged clothes who'd passed us on the street, his shoes worn through at the soles. My father had turned, his eyes locking onto mine with a clarity that made me stand straighter. "Respect isn't earned by medals, son," he'd said. "It's earned by decency." I'd nodded, thinking I understood, but the truth of his words didn't hit me until now, standing on this sidewalk, humbled by a girl who'd shown me what decency really looked like. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man older than the world itself. I felt like a student, sitting quietly in the back of the room, learning a lesson from a girl barely half my age. You wouldn't think a single breakfast plate could change a town, but it did. It started with a sign, small, hand-painted, hanging crookedly in the diner's front window. "Veterans welcome always." No fanfare, no logo, just 4 words that felt like a vow etched in permanence. Emily hadn't asked for it to be hung, hadn't asked for anything at all. After that morning with the soldier, she slipped back into her routine as if nothing had happened. Same faded apron, same gentle smile, same quiet way of refilling coffee without breaking the thread of your thoughts. But we all felt the shift, like a current running beneath the surface of our days. Every morning, without fail, someone in the kitchen would set aside a hot plate, eggs, bacon, toast, stacked neatly near the stove. No one claimed it, no one labeled it, but it always found its way to someone who needed it. A man with a limp who slept by the train tracks, his coat patched with duct tape. A woman layered in worn flannel, her face weathered by more than just the cold. A kid who jingled coins in his pocket, but never had enough for a full meal. No questions were asked, no explanations given. The food just moved, carried by an unspoken agreement that Emily had sparked without a word. The town noticed, and it changed. Sidewalks saw more nods, more smiles exchanged between strangers. Doors were held open a moment longer, hands extended to help carry a heavy bag. The corner store set out a basket of gloves and scarves in the winter, free for anyone who needed warmth. The church brewed a second pot of coffee on Sunday mornings, just in case someone wandered in from the cold. People started stopping to talk to the quiet man by the post office, asking how he was doing instead of hurrying past. We began to see the people we'd overlooked, the ones who blended into the background when life felt too busy to pause. They became the ones we stopped for, the ones we made time to notice, all because Emily had shown us how. In our small town, things weren't perfect, not by a long shot, but they got better, warmer, and somehow wiser, all because of one fleeting moment that shifted the way we saw each other. I sit in my usual booth at the diner, cradling a steaming cup of coffee, my eyes drifting to the sign in the window. It's a simple thing, just a few words, but it makes me smile. Not because our town suddenly transformed into some shining beacon of virtue, but because it remembered what it means to care. And it all started with one young woman who didn't wait for anyone's approval to do what was right. I've lived a long life, long enough to watch the world twist and turn, to see people drift in and out of this town, their faces blurring into the rhythm of time. I thought I had it all figured out. My routines, my opinions, the quiet confidence that comes with age. I'd grown comfortable, maybe too comfortable, in the way I judged the world around me. But that morning, everything changed. It took an army, an actual uniformed army, to teach me what humility really means. But it was one quiet girl, barely noticeable in her apron, who taught me the true weight of honor. I used to think honor was something you earned through visible sacrifice. Years of service, medals pinned to your chest, scars you could point to as proof of your worth. I believe respect was something you'd built over decades, through rank and reputation. But I was wrong, and it stings to admit it. Emily didn't care about any of that. She didn't ask for his name, his rank, or his story. She saw a man sitting alone, shivering in the cold, his eyes carrying a weight no one else seemed to notice. Without hesitation, she gave him something more valuable than a warm meal. She gave him dignity. That single small gesture rang louder than any parade I'd ever seen, louder than any speech I'd ever heard. And I, with all my years of wisdom, had missed it entirely. I judged him. I dismissed him. I assumed I knew who he was based on his worn coat, his unshaven face, the way he sat hunched over like he was trying to disappear. I'd walked past people like him 100 times, my mind already made up, my assumptions locked in place. But Emily saw something I didn't. She saw a person, not a problem. She saw someone worthy of kindness, not because of what he'd done or who he'd been, but simply because he was there, human and hurting. That moment cracked something open inside me, something I didn't even know was sealed shut. Now, when I pass someone on the sidewalk whose clothes are a little too tattered, whose eyes don't quite meet mine, I pause. I don't just keep walking, my mind already racing to the next task. When I hear someone muttering to themselves in the diner, their voice barely audible over the clatter of plates, I lean in a little closer. I don't always understand what they're saying, and I don't always know what to do, but I try. Because kindness isn't about having all the answers. It's about recognizing the humanity in someone, even when they're silent, even when their story is hidden behind tired eyes or a guarded expression. Emily's act wasn't loud or dramatic. It wasn't the kind of thing that stops traffic or makes headlines, but it was powerful in its quietness, like a stone dropped into a still pond, sending ripples outward that touched everyone in that diner. I watched as the other regulars, usually lost in their own conversations, turned their heads. I saw the way the cook paused, his spatula hovering over the grill, his eyes softening. I saw the waitress who'd been wiping down the counter stop, her hand resting on the rag, a faint smile tugging at her lips. We all felt it, the warmth of a moment that reminded us what it means to be human. I think about that man often, the one Emily helped. I wonder about the battles he'd fought, the ones that left no visible scars but weighed heavy on his shoulders. I wonder about the nights he spent alone, the days he walked through a world that didn't seem to see him. And I wonder how many times I'd walked past someone just like him, too caught up in my own life to notice the story they carried. I wonder how many times I'd laughed at someone's quirks or dismissed their struggles, assuming they were less than me, less deserving, less human. Those thoughts sit heavy in my chest, a quiet ache that reminds me to do better. Sometimes the greatest acts of service don't come with uniforms or fanfare. Sometimes they come in the form of a worn apron, a gentle hand pouring coffee, a quiet voice offering a seat to someone who's been overlooked. Emily didn't set out to change the world that morning. She didn't plan to teach an old man like me a lesson I'd carry for the rest of my life. But she did. She showed me what grace looks like, not in grand gestures, but in the small, deliberate choice to see someone, really see them, and act with kindness. I hope I never forget what I saw that day. I hope I never lose the feeling of that moment, the way it humbled me, softened me, made me want to be better. And I hope I never miss the chance to see it again, to notice the people around me, to hear the stories they carry, to offer a hand or a smile when it's needed most. That's what Emily did, and it's what she reminded us all to do. In a world that's always rushing forward, always judging, always assuming, she slowed down long enough to show us that one person can make a difference, not by shouting or demanding attention, but by simply caring. Our town isn't perfect, and it never will be, but it's better because of people like Emily, who remind us that decency still matters, that kindness can ripple outward in ways we can't always predict. So I sit here in my booth, sipping my coffee, watching the world go by outside the diner's window. And I think about the people I've walked past, the ones I've judged, the ones I've failed to see. I think about the stories waiting to be heard, the dignity waiting to be recognized. And I hope, with every fiber of my being, that I can be a little more like Emily, quiet, steady, and brave enough to do what's right, no matter how small it seems.